I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about the offer from our sponsor, The Great Courses. This month is a free month of access to the Great Courses Plus app. So it looks like this. You have your phone or whatever device you're using. You touch on the app like that, boom, and the courses pop up. There's a whole variety of them, really hundreds that you can access. So let's say you're interested in taking this one, The Black Death, which is one I'm currently listening to. And the 24 different lectures pop up. Now, if you're already in the course, the lecture will just pick up wherever it is you last left off, which is a nice feature. Or if you just want to skip around, like say you want to skip from lecture 2 to lecture 13, Medieval Theories about the Black Death, you just touch on that, boom, and a little summary of the lecture pops up, so you can read about whether you want to listen to it or not. And then when you're ready to listen to it, you just hit play, and you're off and running. Now, if you don't want to do that and you decide you want to change courses in the middle, you can just do that. Here's a course I already took, Understanding the Dark Side of Human Nature. This is 24 lectures by Daniel Breyer. Anyway, you get the idea. So the offer this month is a free month of access to the Great Courses Plus. And to do that, go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. Thanks for listening. My guest this week is Daniel Chirot. His new book is You Say You Want a Revolution. He hung a little question mark there. Radical Idealism and Its Tragic Consequences. It's really an important read. Daniel Chirot is the Herbert J. Ellison Professor of Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Henry Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. He's the author of many books, most recently, The Shape of the New, 4 Big Ideas and How They Made the Modern World, which was named one of the New York Times Book Review's 100 Notable Books of the Year. I had also read previously his book, Why Not Kill Them All, about the logic of genocide, logic in the genocidal killer's mind anyway. So the new book is about moderate versus radical revolutions in history, going back to the American Revolution versus the French Revolution, all the way up to current times and what we're going through now. So it's an enlightening read in as much as he treats history like a scientist would. Like these are various different experiments with different variables that have different results. Let's see what we can learn from them. So his last chapter on the 8 lessons that we can learn from this several centuries of violent versus nonviolent revolutions is very enlightening. So with that, I give you Daniel Chirot. Daniel Chirot, your new book is You Say You Want a Revolution, Radical Idealism and Its Tragic Consequences. I was mentioning to you off air, I love the cover with the kind of radical revolution fist, but as you were pointing out, it coming down was kind of a symbol of squashing or using violence rather than the nonviolent approach to revolution.
Yes. So that raised fist pointing up has been for a long time the sign of revolution. Revolutionaries hold up their fist. And we even have a candidate running for president who may get the nomination, who's leading down the polls, who does from time to time raise his fist. So,
Bernie.
Exactly. So it's still a symbol. But in the book is not about Bernie Sanders. It's historical. It's about how so many revolutions have wound up crushing people. The French Revolution and then the Reign of Terror, the Russian Revolution, and what happened with communism. I list right-wing revolutions too. I consider the Nazis to have been a revolutionary movement. They want to transform society, and of course they murdered and crushed millions of people and so on, and other examples. The Iranian Revolution, for example, and many third world revolutions against colonialism, which were quite justified in a sense, wound up doing the same thing. And we have the case of the continuing problem today in Algeria, and what happened to the Algerian Revolution, which turned into a repressive, quite murderous regime that privileges a small number of aging revolutionaries and has damaged the country as a whole. So that's really the thesis of the book.
almost like a law of nature that people, once they get power, it corrupts. The old Lord Acton line about power corrupting absolutely. It just seems almost inevitable unless you have a whole slew of checks and balances to prevent any one person from getting too much power.
Yes, yes. And revolutionary idealists are particularly prone to that because they're very sure of themselves. They have often utopian goals, and that certainly was the case with the communists. It certainly was the case with the Jacobin radicals in the French Revolution. It certainly was the case even with Hitler and the Nazis. I mean, we don't consider that to be nice ideals, but they had an ideal. Hitler had an ideal of a racially pure society where the world would be enslaved to Germany. Now, I mean, that's not an ideal that we might approve of, but there was an ideal there. And the problem is that all those utopian ideals don't work, and they meet resistance. And so when a revolutionary regime meets resistance, it can either fold up its tent and say, oh, all right, we were wrong, but that doesn't happen to people who are really committed, or else say, we're right and the protesters are wrong and we'll crush them. And that's been the response. That was the response of the Reign of Terror. But in the 20th century, you see that over and over again. And in the case of Iran, in the case of the Russian Revolution, in the case of China. And we're still seeing things like that today.
Yeah, and reading your book, particularly that chapter on utopian ideologies, I was thinking of the trolley problem, which of course you know about, where for listeners who don't know, the trolley problem is an old philosophical chestnut in which you're standing next to a switch on a railroad track. There's a trolley hurtling down the track. It's about to kill these 5 workers. Unless you throw the switch and send the trolley down the other track where it kills the one worker. And of course, you're not allowed to yell out, "Get up, there's a trolley coming." It's one of these philosophical thought experiments where it forces you to make a selection between moral choices and different ethical systems. And in online tests of this, of now millions of people through the Harvard site that does this, almost it's like 75%, 80% of people say, yeah, I would throw the switch. Basically doing the utilitarian calculus. It's justified to kill 1 to save 5. Now, they have a harder time doing that if they're up on the second scenario where you're on a bridge and there's a big, huge guy next to you and the trolley is going to go underneath the bridge. And if you throw the guy off, physically grab him and throw him off, he lands on the track, splat, he gets killed, but it stops the trolley and saves the 5 workers. People have a harder time with the actual physical, throwing of somebody, but that kind of utilitarian. So there you have a conflict between kind of rights ethics versus utilitarian ethics. And I think particularly in this, your new book, but also your previous one, Why Not Kill Them All? The Logic of Genocide. You kind of see that, well, if our goal is utopia, perfect society in which everybody is happy forever, but for these guys over here preventing us from getting there, we should kill the 1 to save the 5, essentially. Kill 1 million to save 5 million, kill 10 million to save 50 million. That's kind of what I thought of reading that chapter, that there is a logic to it, as perverse as it may seem.
There certainly is a logic to it, and you have to be a true believer. And that's why, in general, I favor, and of course many other people do too, moderates who say, yes, we need reform, we need to change some things, but we're not going to murder lots of people in order to do it. We don't need to do it very rapidly, and we're not going to wind up, in a sense, this is the essence of liberalism, we're not going to wind up with a utopia, but we can make improvements. Whereas those who say, we can create a utopia, and we'll do it, and it's not just killing 10 million to save 50 million, it's killing as many as necessary for the future. And the future will be beautiful. And the committed revolutionaries, Lenin or the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, or for that matter, Hitler, really believed in what they were doing. In a sense, I have students sometimes who get shocked when I say Hitler was a man of integrity. He said what he was going to do. He wrote about it in Mein Kampf, and he said about doing it. Now, I considered, and most people considered, evil, but he said what he was going to do. He said what he believed in, and he did it. And he didn't care how many people died. And the same with other committed utopians. Now, the problem is, how do such people come to power? It has to be in societies that are already troubled and haven't met the requirements for change that have accumulated over time. That certainly happened with the French Revolution. It was no surprise to anyone who knew what was going on in France that France was troubled, and yet it didn't reform sufficiently fast. Reform was blocked, and then it blew up. The same thing with the Russian Revolution. It was no surprise to anyone that the system wasn't working well. But because of the stubbornness of the Tsar and the people around him, the reforms weren't made. And then with the crisis of World War I, it blew up. And so the same thing with the anti-colonial revolutions. You look at, say, France's behavior in its colonies after World War II, and the French behaved ridiculously. They could have had compromises, gradually giving independence. Ho Chi Minh asked for that. He signed an agreement with the French to do that, and then the French went back on it. And in Algeria, it should have been clear from the beginning that they couldn't maintain the rule of a privileged 10%. And yet they resisted and resisted, and then there was violence, and the violence continued. Lots of people were killed, and it turned into a tragedy.
Yeah.
So the failure to recognize the need for reform and having problems pile up creates a potential for revolution. It doesn't always happen, but it creates a potential, and it opens the door to the radicals who say, look, people have tried moderate reforms, they've tried liberalism, it doesn't work. There's too much resistance. We've got to do something more extreme. And that opens the door to the utopians and extremists who are willing to do anything.
I guess it must be hard to know when you're in the middle of a nation like that undergoing problems, whether you've already tried solutions and they failed, so we have to try something completely different, or whether we just need to try more gradual stuff for another decade or two and we'll finally get there.
Well, one of the paradoxes of quite a few revolutions is that at first, the moderates get control. Again, that happened in the French Revolution. So most of the book is about the 20th century, but I did say quite a lot about the French Revolution. Maybe because I was born in France and I can read French well. But the French Revolution has, of course, it was the iconic revolution, joined in the 20th century by the Russian Revolution and then others since then. But you see in the case of the French Revolution, and that's a very interesting contrast with the American Revolution.
Yeah.
The moderates at first get control. Lafayette, who is an American hero, was also a hero of the early part of the French Revolution and was a potential leader of all of France. He was given command of the army. He was very respected. People loved him. But he was a moderate, and he tried to negotiate between the king and the revolutionaries. The king and the court and the aristocrats considered him a traitor, even though he was an aristocrat, because he had joined the revolution. And the revolutionaries said, look, this guy is just protecting the king. He pretends to be on our side, but he's not. He's just an aristocrat. And he wound up being disliked by everyone. And an order was issued to arrest him. He fled, and then there's his whole political history. But the American Revolution was unusual in that the moderates kept control. And it wasn't a revolution that overthrew the elite. The elite led it and kept control. Of course, that created other problems subsequently because they never addressed the problem of slavery. But the French Revolution and the American Revolution were very different, which is why Marxists and radical historians have often said, oh, the Americans didn't really have a revolution. French had a real revolution.
Well, we fought a 7-year war. That's something of a revolution.
Yes, of course. Of course, it was a major political revolution that created a new kind of government.
But were there radicals pushing to take over from the moderates during the American Revolution?
Well, certainly Thomas Paine wanted to, and he eventually left. And there were others. And there were also popular movements in the early days of the Republic that were more radical, that were put down. So, yes, there were some, but the founding fathers that we remember were all moderates. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, whatever their faults, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, who I think was, in a sense, the best of them all. Well, also Hamilton, because they were against slavery and didn't have slaves. But yes, there were moderates, but there were forces pushing. I mean, the United States, in a sense, was lucky. There was no Paris. There was no really big city. And the Paris mob, in a sense, really played a big role. The same thing happened in Russia, where the communists were first strong, the Bolsheviks, in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. So it varies from case to case.
But on the American one, let's say the radicals had taken over and they had abolished slavery, but then perhaps the southern colonies would not have joined, or maybe
they certainly would not have joined. And if the radicals had taken control, the revolution would have turned into a civil war immediately. This happened in Ireland. I mean, sometimes people forget that the first 20th century successful anti-colonial revolution was the Irish against the English. And after they got their independence, there was a civil war. And Irish politics still remembers that. It had a very strong impact on Ireland. There wasn't mass killing, but there was killing, and there was violence. So the fight between radicals and moderates can take place everywhere. And in the case of Ireland, the extreme radicals didn't win. But in many other cases, they did win, and that's when the tragedy occurs.
Yeah.
I did want to say that I spent some time, as you know, on the Mexican Revolution.
Yeah.
And I've been quite surprised with both my students and also a lot of my colleagues who are specialists in other parts of the world. I'm not talking about my colleagues who are Latin Americanists, but others. Americans as a whole, even well-educated Americans, don't know much about Mexican history.
No.
They don't know how violent it was.
I knew next to nothing until I read your book.
Yeah, and it's kind of strange because, first of all, Mexico is our neighbor.
Yeah.
It's also the world's largest, by population, Spanish-speaking country. It has the most people of any Spanish-speaking Latin American country. Brazil has more, but it's Portuguese-speaking. And I didn't know that much either about the Mexican Revolution. And it was a ghastly affair. But in the end, the radicals didn't get control. So eventually the violence stopped, unlike in the case of the communists or in China, where the killing continues on and on and on and on. So
give us a little potted history of the Mexican Revolution for those of us that don't know much about it.
Well, there was a dictator who had once been considered a liberal, Porfirio Diaz, who opened up Mexico to foreign investment. There was an economic boom of sorts, but a lot of inequality and growing discontent. And he marginalized a lot of the landowning elite. They turned against him. He got old, and old dictators or old kings are always a problem because old people lose touch.
What?
And especially if they've been in power.
Yeah.
Because they only put yes men around themselves.
Like Hindenburg.
Absolutely, Hindenburg. But Porfirio Diaz also, you see the Shah of Iran, he wasn't that old, but he was ill. He completely lost touch. You can see on YouTube interviews with the Shah of Iran a few years before he was deposed saying, "My people love me. We have an ideal system. I'm making Iran one of the great powers in the world." And knowing what happened, you say, this guy's totally out of touch. Anyway, Porfirio Diaz was out of touch. There was pressure for an election. He said he'd have an election, but he cheated. And a moderate, Madero, took power. I mean, there was a revolution, but then everything turned sour. A right-wing general tried to take power and bring back the old system. He was overthrown. And then a succession of generals and military leaders vied for power, not so much on ideological grounds, but though some were more extreme than others, but really for personal power. And it turned into a bloodbath. In 1910, Mexico had about 15 million people and a high birth rate. In 1920, it had about 14 million people and still a high birth rate. So it's estimated that at least 500,000 people were killed outright. Another 500,000 died of disease and famine because of the war. And then in the late 20s, something so few Americans know about, there was an attempt by the Mexican government to crush the church. Americans don't generally understand anti-clericalism in France or Spain or Italy or Mexico because we've never had, at least until now, the rule by one church that imposes its will on others.
Right.
The Catholic Church did in these countries. And so the revolutionary impulse was anti-clerical. But a lot of people remained faithful and fought back. That happened in France. It happened in Mexico, in a part of central and western Mexico, in a war called the War of the Cristeros, of the Christers, who resisted. And about 100,000 more people were killed, and terrible tortures and burning of villages. And then finally, the Mexican regime in the 30s realized that, this wasn't going anywhere, and they backed off. And actually, some of the mediation was done by the American ambassador, who was Charles Lindbergh's father-in-law.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a small detail. And Lindbergh flew down with his wife to see his father-in-law to Mexico. So, but this war of Cristeros, is something that is still alive in Mexico. I gave some lectures in a part of Mexico where this occurred in 2000. I was there in 2013, and I met people there whose grandfathers had fought in this war, and it was still a living memory. Now, how many Americans know about this?
Yeah.
Now, this is our neighbor. I'm not talking about some obscure, faraway place in Central Asia. So, but it was a bloody, bloody affair. But in the end, the party that took control wasn't really very revolutionary. It was actually rather conservative and became very corrupt. And Mexico still suffers from the corruption that ensued.
Yeah. You let slip there a comment until now about the role of religion in politics. Do you mean the rise of the Christian right, Christian conservatism in America?
Well, yes, Christian conservatism, and a speech that the Attorney General gave recently, in which he said, I think he gave it at Notre Dame, and he said he doesn't believe in the separation of church and state.
Yeah, I know, that was very disturbing.
Well, it is very disturbing, and if you go back to the American Revolution, why did the founding fathers and early decisions about this matter want to separate church and state? They wanted to separate church and state because they knew European history. The most terrible wars in Europe until the 20th century, World War I and World War II were wars, but until then, were the wars of religion in the 16th and 17th century between Protestants and Catholics.
Yeah.
And they knew that. They knew that history, and they knew what had happened. And they knew that the United States was already religiously diverse, not as much as today, but there were different Christian sects. There were some Catholics, and Catholics were discriminated against in England, but there were some Catholics here, and there were different Protestant denominations. And American Revolution, including Washington, also knew there was a small Jewish community, and Washington went out of his way to reassure the Jews because all over Europe there were discriminatory laws. Yeah. But that wasn't the main issue. The main issue was, well, the dominant religion of the founding fathers was really the Church of England, which changed its name to Episcopalian. But if we impose that, there are going to be denominations, maybe the Methodists, maybe the Catholics, who knows what's going to come up, who will dislike this. And look at what happened in Europe, and we don't want that to happen. So it's very dangerous to have a state religion.
There were some colonies that had an official religion, right?
Yes, there were. And the separation of church and state was not enforced in all the states. But it's part of the Constitution, and it's federal, and it's been expanded over time. And of course, in the United States, if we have a dominant state religion, it's going to create an enormous amount of conflict.
Yeah.
So if you're a good Christian, or if you're a good anything, you should try to avoid that.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been tracking that since the 80s because of their influence on the teaching of evolution, one of my areas of study. And that's always been a problem in the moral majority and Reagan and Bush and so forth. But then when 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, I thought, okay, I always thought of these people as principled, or they believe their morals. Why are they voting for this guy who is like the least Christian person in the history of United States politics? And then it occurred to me, well, he's going to get them the judges that they want to overturn Roe v. Wade and, whatever else is on their moral agenda to dominate the American political scene. But what do you make of all that?
Well, I mean, I should say, as you know, that my book is actually more about history than about
yeah.
So my editor at Princeton University Press keeps on telling me, you should write op-ed pieces that are contemporary because people are more interested in contemporary. But looking historically, it's not just Catholics or certain Protestant denominations. It's any very strong ideology that is in a sense religious, though we don't think of it as religious, like the communists. In the Soviet Union, in the 20s and 30s, there was very severe persecution of the church, of the Orthodox Church. And then that eased off later, but there continued to be religious persecution, anti-Semitism against Protestant sects. And you see some of that coming back in Russia, where the Orthodox Church is now an ally of Putin. You see religious persecution in China against all religions at first, and now this terrible persecution of Muslims there, not just Uyghurs and Kazakhs. And the rationale for that is, look, we have the right religion. I put that in quotes because we don't think of communism as a religion, but it really is, in fact, it's a matter of faith.
It's a faux religion. It's kind of an ideological religion.
Yeah, and so was Nazism.
And
Hitler made his peace with Catholics and Protestants, but he didn't like them. And if he had won, they would have been brought under control. So when you have a strong faith and think that justifies persecuting others, then you get these terrible results. So that hasn't happened in the United States, but it could. There were certainly local movements like that. I mean, there was discrimination, nothing like in Germany, of course, but there was discrimination against Jews. We see some of the same phenomenon possibly about Muslims. Who knows? It's dangerous. If you have an absolute faith and think you're justified in enforcing that and even killing people who don't go along with you, then you bring about a disaster.
Yeah.
The worst of the civil war in France during the revolution was over this issue of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Because among common people, among ordinary people, particularly certain peasants, but not just, there were people who really believed in their faith. And many of them went along with the early stage of the revolution, but they didn't want to see their village priests persecuted and killed. And so they fought back.
Right. It's almost like back to where we started with the kind of ideological utopian fantasies, this desire for there to be an outside objective form of morality or imposing of moral values on everybody because they're objectively true or right. And so usually that's religion because the supernatural God figure gives you that outside source. But say something like Marxist ideology in early 20th century communist Russia was a kind of outside source. Like Marxian history is this kind of almost a supernatural force that marches along. Yes. Separate from you and I doing whatever we're doing. It's not part of human nature. It's part of historical nature, whatever that is. And therefore we should bend to it or help it along, something like that. And then you're back to a kind of quasi-religious war.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a faith-based adherence to Marxism that is religious. And in fact, it was treated as such. So after Lenin dies, he doesn't get buried.
Yeah.
In fact, I saw Lenin.
I did too. I've been to his tomb. Yeah, it's incredible.
He looks a little plasticky, but
it's a little moldy around the cheeks, but yeah.
And then the same thing was done with Mao. The same thing with Stalin, but in a reaction against Stalin, he was taken out and he's buried right next to Lenin, but he's actually buried.
Yeah. And
the same thing with Ho Chi Minh. Even though Ho Chi Minh said that's not what he wanted. Ho Chi Minh was a rather different kind of a person. He was, in a sense, more modest. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, but So yes, it is a religion. So if you're going to turn the dead body of your founding leader into an idol, well, that's religion, right? Maybe there's no God, but you could say for them, Marx was God and Lenin was Jesus Christ,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And Lenin could make no mistake.
Right.
Uh,
Well, it's like and Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, that 1,000-year, the millennium. That's a very Christian
right.
idea.
Absolutely. Yes, that's right. Yeah. And it was quasi-religious. And in fact, you can see movies of the Nazi gatherings once Hitler was in power, and they're very religious ceremonies.
Yeah, yeah, the torches and all the flags and all
Right.
the iconography. Yeah, I saw. Yeah, I was in Moscow about a year ago, and even on a weekday, I got there maybe an hour before it opened, and there was already like an hour and a half line to get into the mausoleum, the Lenin mausoleum. And once there, they screen everybody, clear all the backpacks, metal detectors, no photographs. I mean, it was like, what am I going to see Jesus here?
Yes, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now let's go back to the American and French revolutions. We often think of these as, liberal revolutions, as you say, moderate and modest.
At first in France.
At first, yeah. But the kind of ideological foundation of modern conservatism is Edmund Burke, who is kind of seen as, the founder of conservatism. And his book on comparing the American Revolution and French Revolution, is very revealing, in which he says, well, the French went wrong where they too quickly dismantled these traditional institutions that hold society together, because we can't just reinvent everything, because no one's smart enough to do that. So that's kind of a modern conservative way. We want to conserve institutions because they work. Family, faith, flag, the whole thing. How do you sort of tease those apart, liberal versus conservative interpretations of these revolutions?
Well, yes, Burke is held up as a conservative, but he's in many ways a classical Enlightenment liberal. He was in favor of the Americans. I mean, he thought that the British government made a mistake, that in fact the Americans were right, and that they should have been given representation. I think we have a small problem here, but we're back.
Okay. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep. I can hear you.
Okay. Okay. So conservative, yes, but he wasn't a reactionary. He was a brilliant man. He foresaw what was going to happen before the Reign of Terror actually started. They're heading in the wrong direction, and then it happened. And you don't have to be a conservative to dislike the Reign of Terror. French liberals have always disliked it. The Third Republic enshrined Danton as a liberal hero, which was an exaggeration. But Robespierre, the radical, was condemned. And in fact, there's a big statue of the so-called moderate liberal Danton in the middle of Paris. There's no statue of Robespierre. So Burke was conservative, you could say, in an American sense. In Europe, he might have been considered a classical liberal, not an extremist, opposed to extremism, opposed to violence, opposed to saying we have to change everything, but certainly in favor of reform.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Although, and then another point on that, since we didn't end slavery at that time, and it ended up taking a 5-year war and 650 to 700,000 dead to end slavery, was there a way to reform the system to eventually get rid of it? Say by the end of the 19th century, it would have ended anyway, economically or something like that? Or do you sometimes really need to just use violence to bring about social change?
Well, that's difficult to say, but I think, and it's easy to look back and say this should have been done. But when Britain abolished slavery in its colonies, it paid off the slave owners because these were big investments. Now, by the 1850s, they were even bigger investments. and they were huge investments by a small number of big slave owners. But I think that would have been a solution. The problem was that the founding fathers, even those who had slaves, thought it would die of its own.
Right.
And what they didn't know was that the Industrial Revolution had started.
Yeah.
And that the invention of the cotton gin and the need for cotton fiber by industrializing Britain and then the rest of the world would greatly increase the demand for cotton and therefore make slavery much more profitable than it had been before. So the prohibition in the Constitution is that slave trading or import of slaves, not internal slave raiding, but raiding for slaves and bringing them in, would be made illegal in 1808. And the idea was slavery would gradually die off. It did in Brazil without much violence, though it took much longer. It was only in the 1880s. When the British finally abolished it, they did pay off the owners. And that might have been a solution. But of course, it's easy for us to say that. I don't think Jefferson anticipated how strong it would be.
Right. Yeah, and also paying off all the slave owners of the South in the, say, 1850s would have been rather different than what the British government did, maybe.
Oh, yeah. By the 1850s, it was impossible because the South was under the control of elite slave owners who were pushing for separation. And Lincoln and the leading abolitionists promised to do it gradually. Lincoln's platform was not we're going to end slavery, but we're going to prevent its expansion.
Right.
And the Southern slave owners who were in control said, well, ultimately that means that we'll be so outvoted that we'll lose slavery. And they were the radicals. They were the radical counter-revolutionaries. You could think of, though that's not usually the way it's taught, of the Civil War as the second act of the revolution.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess another point I'm driving at, maybe this is not central to your book, but like I'm thinking of the colonial general in India who put an end to sati, the practice of burning widows on a funeral pyre, and the British colonial general there said, you're going to stop doing that. And if you do it, we're going to hang you. And they said, well, that's our cultural tradition, sati. And they said, well, our cultural tradition is when people burn women, we hang them. So you practice your cultural tradition and build your funeral pyres, and we'll practice our cultural tradition and build our gallows. And so let's see how this goes. Sometimes it takes a strong arm and a guy with a gun to say, you're not going to do this. Like when I think it was Eisenhower sent the troops in to integrate the school system in, was it Alabama, I think? And Arkansas, because they said, well, we're not going to do it. We don't care what the Supreme Court says. This is our state Supreme Court says segregation forever and so on. And the federal government says, you're going to integrate. And if you don't, we're sending in armed troops.
Well, look, about India, the British reforms in India would be more convincing if they had understood in the 1920s that they should start moving toward independence instead of jailing Gandhi and Nehru. And British colonialism, all colonialism, is based on force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the colonial rule was repressive.
Yeah.
The most famous case was the massacre in Amritsar, where British troops, actually they were mostly Indian soldiers with British officers, fired on a crowd and killed 1,000 people. But this is only the best known one. It was repressive and it was racist.
Right.
And so, yes, I agree that it was a good idea to stop widow burning. But on the other hand, the British also made relations between Muslims and Hindus worse by trying to play off one against the other.
Right.
And it was a fundamentally repressive and racist system. When this massacre occurred in Amritsar in, I think, 1921, or right around then, most of the English whites in India approved And so whether you're talking about French colonialism or British colonialism, or even American colonialism that imposed itself on the Philippines in a very bloody war because there was an uprising against American colonization, something else most Americans don't know about. You know, it's more than just an ideological question. People don't like to be run by foreigners.
Right. Yeah.
And so, yes, the British said, and the French said the same thing, because at home they were liberal democracies. We're civilizing these people.
Right.
When you actually go on the ground and see what was done, it's not so clear that was what was happening.
Not so civil.
Yeah, well, in French schools, kids were taught until recently, I don't know what they're teaching right now, but until recently, that France's colonial mission was to help civilize people. Well, that's not how people saw it.
Right.
And there was violence and racism, and it wasn't pretty, and it united people who otherwise would not have been united against colonial rule. And the colonial powers, and the French and the British were the worst in a sense, because at home they were democracies. They simply refused to accept that until it was too late.
Yeah.
At least the British pulled out of India without trying to fight, but they bear a heavy responsibility for the way in which Pakistan and India were divided, and for all the resulting catastrophe since then, endless wars, and it's still, it's still a bad situation.
Yeah. You mean when the colonial ruler leaves, finally, then you end up with civil wars and contests between local big men competing to be the top guy.
But certainly sometimes you have to use force.
Yeah.
And in the early stage of the French Revolution, like the American Revolution, wanted a political change, and it was resisted. And so force was necessary. The problem is what happens then? Who gets control?
Yeah. Right. There's a vacuum that gets filled.
Yeah.
And you just hope the son of a bitch who fills it is our son of a bitch, not the other ideology son of a bitch, right?
Well, it depends. I mean, the United States has certainly made a lot of mistakes, particularly during the Cold War, of supporting right-wing dictators, like the Shah of Iran.
Right.
The Shah of Iran was doing some bad things. There was torture, there was repression. The problem is that he gets overthrown. At first, for a short while, there's a liberal. He gets overthrown, flees to Paris, and eventually gets murdered by Iranian agents. And then the extremists take over, and they kill a lot more people. The same in Russia. The Tsar's regime was brutal and oppressive.
Yeah.
And the communists who took over were many times more repressive and murderous.
Right.
So the United States was fortunate that didn't happen here until the Civil War. You mentioned the number. Some say now, maybe some of the most recent research, 750,000 dead.
Yeah.
The United States had about 30 million people then. That would be as if today 6 or 7 million died.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what it would be like if we had a civil war and that many died?
Yeah.
Well, that's what happened.
Yeah. Just as a sidebar, because it's a personal interest of mine of what ended slavery. So I do these debates. I'm an atheist, so I do these debates with people like Dinesh D'Souza, who's a conservative Christian public intellectual, and of course, he credits Christianity. That you can find this passage in Paul where he says, everybody is the same under God's whatever, and of course he points to the the Quakers and some of the early, I guess, Episcopalians that supported equal rights and the abolition of slavery. But really, their main opponents, my counter to this, is all their fellow Christians who said, no, slavery is the way God wants it, and it's fully justified in the Bible and so on. And so I argue it's more like the rights revolutions of initially the Enlightenment that started us down the path toward thinking about everybody being treated equally under the law. Everyone has the same equal rights and so forth. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that debate.
Well, the contemporary fundamentalist Christian movement comes directly out of 19th century Protestant fundamentalism that was abolitionist and was anti-slavery.
Yeah.
But there was a split in churches between the South and the North. The Baptists split over this issue. And I am always suspicious of anyone who cites original texts to explain subsequent events.
Right.
You can read passages in the Quran which are about peace and tolerance, and you can read passages that are just the opposite.
Right.
And you can do the same thing in the Bible.
Right.
So if you say it's inherent in Christianity, nonsense. So what were France, England, the Netherlands, the Danes? The Danes also were slavers, not on as big a scale, but the Spanish, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, they were all Christians, and they bent the Bible to justify what they were doing.
Right.
And abolitionists could do the same. Some of them were religious.
Right.
So it's what you make of religion now. It's the same thing with Islam. You remember after 9/11, George W. Bush said Islam is a religion of peace. Well, for some, but for others not.
Right.
So here's someone saying, oh, in the original text, in the original Quran, you can see the roots of terrorism. In the original Christian Bible, you can see anti-slavery. Well, how come it takes 2,000 years for
right.
Christians then? So it was mixed.
Yeah.
And original text don't tell you much. By the way, the same thing happens with Marxism. Marxists can point to passages in Marx that seem quite mild.
Right.
And then others not, but it's what's done with it.
Workers of the world, unite, throw off your chains. Then the fist comes out.
Yeah. I actually think there's not that much moderation in Marx, but there certainly is in the Bible or any holy text, but there's also the opposite. Look at India today. People used to say about Hinduism that it didn't have this radicalism. Well, it does in India. What people say about Buddhism, I've heard a lot of Americans who say, oh, Buddhism, they respect peace and so on.
Yeah.
Well, Sri Lanka is Buddhist, and they have terrible ethnic relations, and Thailand and Burma is too.
Right.
So, what's the reality and what's in the original text? So you take from the original text what you want.
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote this book, The Moral Arc, about, the arc of the moral universe's long bends towards justice and so on. You can document certain trends that seem to be positive in that direction. I don't believe in forces of history. I think it just comes from all of us changing our, moral attitudes toward other people. How that happens, no one really knows. The moral zeitgeist kind of shifts over decades and centuries. And, we all just start thinking about other people in a different way than our ancestors did. What is your sense of what drives, say, revolutions to become less radical because they don't work as well? And is that even a true trend over, say, the last 2 centuries? Are revolutions becoming more peaceful, less violent, less radical, say?
No. It depends which ones.
Right.
The ones in Eastern Europe, and at first even in Russia in 1989 to 1991, were astoundingly peaceful.
Yeah.
The communist elites gave up. The only place in Eastern Europe where there was a lot of violence was in Romania. And the amount of violence there were over 1,000 people killed, but definitely under 2,000. And a lot of that was just from the chaos. It was pretty mild compared to what could have happened if there'd been real resistance. My specialty used to be Romania, and I know Romanian, and I did research and wrote a book about Romania. And so I know a lot about what happened there. And it could have become much more violent if the army had stayed with the dictator, but they didn't. And elsewhere in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, it was quite peaceful. In Yugoslavia, it was terrible. Communism collapsed, and hundreds of thousands of people got killed, and many more hundreds of thousands were dispossessed and became refugees. So it really depends. You can have a relatively peaceful or even a very peaceful revolution, and it has happened. But when it gets into the hands of extremists, and we still don't know the ultimate outcome in Eastern Europe. I mean, it turns out they may not be all that democratic, but they certainly avoided the kind of violence that occurred in the French Revolution, or more recently, the Iranian Revolution, or the continuing warfare, civil warfare in Algeria, which killed hundreds of thousands of people in the 1990s. So more peaceful, it depends where.
Yeah.
And we have yet to see. I mean, China is conducting what amounts to a genocidal campaign against Uyghurs and other Muslims.
Yeah. Yeah. A lifelong interest of mine has been the Nazis. And to try to answer this question, how do you take a group of people, a nation, that's some of the most educated, cultured, intelligent people, the nation that gave us Goethe and Beethoven and, all the great literary works and scientists and so on. How do you turn them into Nazis in the course of a couple of years? And lately I've been kind of rethinking this, that maybe that's not what happened. Maybe they were never in the majority in terms of adaptation of the Nazi ideology. And I got this idea. I had this author, Hugo Mercier, on my podcast, who has a new book out called Not Born Yesterday. So he's a cognitive scientist who studies to what extent people default to truth and they just believe everything, or are we kind of naturally skeptical and it takes a lot to convince somebody to change their deepest beliefs. So he argues, for example, most propaganda doesn't work. You have to, force it upon the people because your propaganda campaigns aren't very effective. So he's got some citations from like Ian Kershaw about the rise of Hitler that, most of Goebbels' propaganda wasn't very effective, and that they really did have to lock up any dissenters to make the ideology seemingly acceptable. So then you get this psychological principle called pluralistic ignorance, or the spiral of silence, where everybody thinks everybody else believes it, but they themselves don't. And, the emperor's new clothes, everybody's like pretending he's got clothes on, but finally somebody says, he's naked. Well, you just lock those people up before they say anything, and then everybody, kind of goes along with it. And I'll just cite one piece of research here that he cites about this study. Even if Nazi propaganda is responsible for only a small share of the anti-Semitism currently present in Germany, it certainly seems to have contributed to the problem. But did it do so through brute repetition, as Hitler thought? So the study by Voigtlander and Wuth looked at the regional variations in the availability of propaganda, how many people own radios, the number of cinemas where they could watch propaganda films, and so forth. If mere repetition was effective, areas with greater exposure to propaganda should see the sharpest rise in anti-Semitism. In fact, the sheer exposure to propaganda had no effect at all. Instead, it was the presence of pre-existing anti-Semitism that explained the regional variation in the effectiveness of propaganda. And then he cites Ian Kershaw, scouring the records of Nazi Germany to understand Hitler's popularity, also analyzed the effectiveness of Nazi propaganda. He reached similar conclusions. The Germans didn't heed the calls to boycott Jewish stores and ostracize the Jews more generally. It was only through terror and legal discrimination that the Nazis achieved, quote, the economic and increasingly social exclusion of the Jews from German life. And then he cites, after Stalingrad and the war started to go bad, that Goebbels' unvarying message of victory was becoming monotonic and ignored by the public, who trusted the BBC over official government programs. Anyway, it goes on and on like this a little bit. For example, another study showing that it's sort of like Daniel Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, that there were a lot of people who were, the people that were already anti-Semitic were more open to Hitler's propaganda, but people who weren't were not persuaded that, hey, this Nazi ideology is a great idea, let's adopt it. Anyway, you see where I'm going with this. To what extent maybe most Germans they weren't Nazis. So we don't have so much to explain.
Well, I have some opinions about that.
Yeah.
I should say that Ian Kershaw is a great historian. He's, I think, the best contemporary historian of Nazism. Another book of his is about the last year of Nazi rule in Germany. And this fascinating question, they held out until what? The Soviet army was 2 blocks away from Hitler's bunker.
Right.
And the army didn't rebel. Now, he also points out that they became much more repressive than they had been before. But by 1944, the majority of Germans were more afraid of the Soviets than they were of continued Nazi rule. And that brings me to a point. By the way, most historians of the Holocaust don't like Daniel Goldhagen's book. They think it's a gross exaggeration. Because his thesis is basically, even without Hitler, this would have happened because Germany was so anti-Semitic. No, if you go back to 1900, the most anti-Semitic country in Western Europe, not in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe, was France. And if you were to predict, no one in 1900 thought that something like the Holocaust would take place. And there have been some very good historians, Benjamin Carter Hett now and others before that, who pointed out that the Nazis came to power in a very strange way. And this has contemporary importance. German conservatives, who were by and large anti-Semitic, but much like in the United States, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. You know, there were signs in hotels in the United States, no Jews. But that doesn't mean that those people wanted to kill all the Jews. German conservatives were by and large sort of like that. But what they feared most was domination by communists, but also social democrats, who they were more willing to ally themselves with the far right than to ally themselves with moderate left of center people. And this is actually what we see in the United States today in the Republican Party. They're more willing to ally themselves with someone who most of them actually don't approve of that much than to allow both liberals who they consider more dangerous to come to power. And Charles Murray, who's a well-known conservative, even wrote a piece denouncing Trump and saying, I would vote for Trump over Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, though I might consider maybe voting for Joe Biden. Probably isn't going to get the nomination anyway. And that was what brought Hitler to power. It was that conservatives, not just Hindenburg and the people around him, but in general, were more willing to go along with ideas that they didn't necessarily approve of. And the attitude was, I mean, of course, Ian Kershaw is right if he says that most Germans were not, and there's a lot of research that shows most Germans were not really that interested in exterminating Jews, but they went along. And it's interesting reading the autobiographies of German generals like Guderian or von Manstein. And they said, well, we didn't really know what was going on. You know, nonsense. Of course they knew what was going on.
Right.
And ordinary people knew what was going on.
Yeah.
They went along. They went along. And well, that's true. But of course, that was always true of communism. It's always true of most extremes. I mean, it's true with religion, too. Many people have a kind of a faith and don't necessarily want to persecute others. But if it comes to that, if you have to make a choice between your people, even if they're too extreme, and the opposition, you go with those who are too extreme.
Yeah,
that's what happened in the South at the start of the Civil War. Most people were not major slave owners, but if it came to decide, they'd rather go along with their elite that was undemocratic toward whites too, than to go along with the North. And that's the crucial thing about how Hitler came to power. Conservatives thought, well, you know, this guy's kind of crazy, but look, he does appeal to people. And he can get votes, and so we'll use him.
They thought they could control him.
Right, and then it turned out he wasn't so easy to use. You saw the same thing with Kerensky in Russia, who thought at a critical moment, he armed the Bolsheviks because he thought that they would help him ward off right-wing generals who were threatening St. Petersburg or Petrograd. And then, they found out, well, you can't really control Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Once they're armed, you can't control them. And we may be facing a situation sort of like that could even get worse with other leaders. If it's better to have some extreme Republican, maybe the Democrats will do the same thing. Maybe it's better to have an extreme on the left than to go along with the moderates in the middle. Well, I mean, that's how moderation disappears.
Mm-hmm.
So to say that most Germans didn't agree, well, they did. They went along.
Yeah.
The German army didn't rebel. German officers, high officers, had plots to overthrow Hitler in 1938. And then in 1938, he had this great success. He won at Munich, and they said, oh, well, he's doing well. And then it comes up again in 1944 when he's losing the war.
Right.
And Stauffenberg and others who revolted and then got executed or turned into heroes. They weren't heroes. They went along until Hitler started losing. Right. And then what they wanted was to keep some of the gains that Germany had made.
Right.
And the Americans and the British to go along fighting against the Soviets.
Right.
So this, and you read this, I mean, Rommel was considered sort of a hero. He wasn't a hero. He was a dedicated German who believed in Nazism, but who had a better tactical sense, sort of realized in 1944 that the way Germany was going wasn't going to end well.
Right.
So we have to be very careful about this. I know a lot about France during the occupation. I was born in Vichy, France, and my family was Jewish. And so we were hidden in a village.
Wow.
And I was a baby, so I don't remember, of course, but, I was told about it. I know a lot of people, my parents' friends who lived through all of this. Most French people weren't either for or against collaboration. They were just trying to survive.
Right.
But they went along with whoever was in charge.
Right. I mean, I suspect that's what most of us would do. I mean, we all say, well, I would never join the Nazi Party. Well, you don't know what you would do. That was sort of the point of the banality of evil and the Milgram shock experiments. Any of us could be sort of carried along. Even if internally you go, look, I'm not buying any of this. I don't think I should shock people. I don't want to gas Jews or whatever. But, slowly down the line you go and years go by and you're in the system, and I've read a lot about these, the Holocaust and the Milgram shock experiments and all that. I actually did a replication of the Milgram shock experiments for a Dateline NBC show. We ran 7 subjects that they thought they were trying out for a reality TV show on NBC called What a Pain. And we just wanted to see how far they would go up the top. We actually rebuilt the box with the toggle switches. We used the same scripts that Milgram used and the whole thing. And we got most of them to go all the way. But they were clearly uncomfortable with it. They were not happy at all, but they were thinking, well, I mean, here I am in NBC. I mean, I can't really be hurting somebody. And, well, I might get to be on this show and so on. And so I kind of rethink this. There's the internal thoughts. I'm just going to go along, but I don't really believe it or what. But then there's your actual actions. So, again, back to this, most Germans, reminds me of Werner von Braun, who said, well, I didn't know about the slave labor camps that built Peenemünde where the rockets were. Well, of course he did. But so it kind of comes down to this. And then another big question, about like the mass bombing of Dresden and Hamburg and other cities, Berlin, with this idea, Bomber Harris and Curtis LeMay. Well, if we bomb the crap out of the cities, the population will rise up and overthrow the Nazis. That seems kind of unrealistic. What can the average guy do in Dresden to overturn the Nazis because he's unhappy a city got bombed?
Well, here we're going into something that, of course, I have opinions about, but it goes quite a bit beyond my book.
Yeah.
Whether Bomber Harris should be blamed or not, I don't know. Some of it was revenge. I mean, after all, the Germans had tried to do the same thing, and they were still killing people almost until the end in London with the V2s. The V1s, they learned how to stop them, but the V2s could never be stopped. What happens in warfare, all wars kill civilians. So that's not a good judge. That's not a good way to judge moral issues. Some armies are more restrained than others. Soviet armies coming into Eastern Europe and Germany were given permission to rape and loot. Americans, there were some rapes and some looting, but Americans were told they shouldn't do that. And when an army is told, "Oh, go ahead, it's okay to do that," then it gets much worse.
Yeah.
Only people who have been in combat can understand the stresses, the fear, and your reaction when you just kill prisoners, even though you're not supposed to. I mean, these are people who've been trying to kill you.
Yeah.
So leaving that aside, a deeper question is, why do so many people go along in revolutions that become bloody?
Yeah.
So, Stalin killed tens of millions of people. Was there ever a revolt by concentration camp guards? No. Were all of them devoted Marxists? No. But the leadership was, and so people were employed. The same thing in German concentration camps. I mean, there have been books about German killers. And some people just went along. Some people were true believers. If the true believers are in charge and they have a cadre of true believing followers and they control force, then they can get most to go along.
Yeah.
Did all Germans want to exterminate Jews? No. Did some Germans actually do something about it? A few, very few.
Yeah.
The same thing happened in France during the occupation. Who turned in Jews in France? The French police did. Did they have to do it? They didn't have to do it. The Germans didn't have enough police or military in France to do it on their own. So why did they go along? Well, the Vichy government went along. Why did they go along? They went along because they thought they could get a better deal from Germany if they did it. So,
right.
And then it happened, and you can tell the 75,000 French Jews who perished. Well, most French people didn't really agree with that, and probably a lot of Germans didn't either. Well, tough luck, you happen to get exterminated.
Right.
So that's where leadership really counts.
Yeah.
And that's where sometimes professional social scientists, political scientists, economists, sociologists, who don't really believe that individuals matter that much, fail. And that's where historians who study these individuals really shine.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you on that point. No Hitler, no Holocaust. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So probably what would have happened is that the army would have taken power. Probably what would have happened is that they would have rearmed, that the British and the French wouldn't have done anything. They didn't do anything when Hitler was rearming. Probably they would have attacked Poland and taken back the corridor that separated Germany from East Prussia, retaken Danzig, and then who knows what would have happened. Germany was already and would have become even more the dominant power in Europe. Would they have gotten into a war with the French and the British? Maybe, maybe not. With the Soviet Union? Maybe, maybe not. But there was no military plan for a Holocaust. No Hitler, no Holocaust. Yeah. I agree with that completely. And you mentioned Goebbels. I mean, I'm sure you can say he wasn't that effective. Ian Kershaw has written quite a lot, but he wrote an earlier book before his massive and really definitive biography of Hitler, about Hitler, in which he said that Hitler was a very shrewd propagandist himself. All his speeches in the beer halls and so on never tried to convince people who were fundamentally opposed. He tried to do was to bring over people who were conservative, opposed to what had happened at Versailles, and were willing to listen to him. He never tried to convert socialists or real liberals to his side. That's perfectly true. What he did was to try to mobilize those who tended to believe in him.
Yeah.
And that works. So, I mean, I don't mean to say that he's a Hitler, but Donald Trump has figured that out. He's not trying to convince people who are fundamentally hostile to him. He's not trying to convince people who are strongly in the Democratic Party. He's trying to rally those people who are inclined to agree with him. And he does that very well.
Yeah.
And that's not the same thing. That doesn't mean that he has majority support. It means that he can bring out people. And actually, Bernie Sanders is doing the same thing.
Yeah, right.
And it works. Certainly all revolutionaries have done that. They've always understood you're not going to convince. That's also the essence of Marxism. You're not going to convince the class enemy. So mobilize those who might agree with you.
Another one of my interests is conspiracy theories. To what extent did people believe the stab in the back conspiracy theory about the First World War and the Jews?
Well, they certainly believed in the stab in the back. Whether Jews, it was Jews and socialists.
Yeah.
Social Democrats. And that was one reason why, not the only reason, but one reason why the Americans and the British and the Soviets agreed that there had to be unconditional surrender and occupation of Germany. Because in World War I, though there was virtual famine in Germany and people were suffering economically, Germany was never invaded.
Mm-hmm.
Fighting was all on French and Belgian soil.
Right.
And then on the Eastern Front, of course, the Germans won. And so there was never an occupation of parts of Germany by the Russians after World War I. And so people really genuinely said they didn't know how bad the situation was. Well, wait a moment. We were still occupying parts of France and Belgium. So why did we surrender?
Yeah.
And the general who said to the government, you have to surrender, Ludendorff, and Hindenburg, but Ludendorff was actually the brains in the operation. He knew that they were about to get crushed because their last offensive had failed. The Americans were now pouring in troops.
Yeah.
He told the government, we have to surrender. And then he was the one who said we were stabbed in the back. And so I think that was pretty widely believed. I don't know in polling what it would have shown. But I think it was widely believed, and it was widely believed that the Versailles Treaty was unfair to Germany.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it worries me because you hear this on the far right today. The Jews will not replace us line that was repeated at that rally where the woman was killed in Charlottesville. You know, the Jews won't replace us. What the hell does that mean? You know, there aren't very many Jews, and they don't have a conversion program. Oh, they're talking about this old conspiracy theory about the Jews running the media and the economy and the banking and the finance, and they're trying to replace us that way.
Right. So that's very interesting. The persistence of mythologies about Jews.
Yeah.
That are very old. During the plague in the Middle Ages, it was thought the Jews had spread them, and then the whole myth that goes in Central and Eastern Europe into the late 19th and early 20th century, the Jews are kidnapping Christians to take their blood for Passover service.
Right.
I mean, that's complete and total nonsense.
Right.
And yet it was believed. So that's a whole other topic best dealt with by people who are historical psychologists.
Yeah, why the Jews? Well, everyone has a useful enemy, I suppose, but it seems like the Jews have been picked on more than most useful enemies.
Yeah, certainly in Europe and elsewhere too. There's anti-Chinese feeling in Southeast Asia that goes back centuries. Right. And at one point in the 1920s, I think he was still crown prince, but then became king of Thailand. Travels in Europe, and he comes back to Thailand and he says, "Oh, I understand the Chinese. It's the Jews, but here it's the Chinese. It's Chinese merchants."
Right.
And well, the difference is that, of course, next to Southeast Asia, there's a very large country called China.
Right.
And part of the mythology about Jews was that somehow there was some great power somewhere.
Right.
For Hitler, that was the Soviet Union, and Hitler was quite convinced that Stalin was being run by Jews, which was also ridiculous.
Right.
because there were a fair number of Jews associated with Lenin, and those who survived, Stalin purged them all if they were at a high position.
Right.
But Hitler really did believe in these theories. I've read that Hitler and Himmler were astonished when they took over Europe, how few Jews there were.
Right.
Where did this come from? I mean, part of it is very old. Part of it is religious. The Jews, as a quite fundamentalist Christian pastor said to me, who didn't mean to sound anti-Semitic. He said to me, the problem with the Jews is that they were the chosen people, and when Christ came along, they missed the boat.
Right.
So, I mean, this person was in no sense an anti-Semite, but
yeah.
So
but that is what Christians believe. I mean, even if they don't have an anti-Semitic bone in their body, they believe Jesus is the Messiah. And Jews believe in a Messiah, just that it isn't Jesus.
Right. Well, and the Muslims too. I mean, for Muslims, Jesus was a prophet,
but not the Messiah. Yeah.
Not because that was Muhammad.
Right.
So you can believe these things, but not spin conspiracy theories about them. So perhaps this is not the place to discuss the origins of anti-Semitism or the modern manifestation of it. It does take a new turn in the mid-19th century when it's associated with biology.
Right.
And the findings of Pasteur, primarily Pasteur, but others, of course, that disease is something caused by hidden agents.
Right.
Which, of course, is true. I mean, if you look at yourself, you don't see bacteria or viruses running around. And so Pasteur discovers this, and Koch in Germany and others. And so this was latched onto that Jews were actually a unseen infectious agent that destroys societies.
Right.
Hitler's writing is full of that.
Yeah.
An interesting sideline. People wonder why, after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States.
Yeah.
You know, Franklin Roosevelt was very pleased about that. He knew that Germany was actually even more of a threat than Germany, but there was still a lot of feeling about not going to war. Of course, after Pearl Harbor, going to war against Germany, that was against Japan. I'm sorry, that was accepted, not Germany. So there are many reasons. He had an alliance with Japan. He was hoping that Japan would keep the Americans occupied, maybe eventually help him against the Soviet Union. But there's a passage in Mein Kampf in which Hitler says, which great power can we be absolutely sure that it's not dominated by Jews? Japan. Why Japan? Well, Jews can worm their way into America, into Britain, into France. They've tried it in Germany, but they can't pass as Japanese. So we're sure that the Jews don't run Japan. So a biological explanation comes out to actually increase anti-Semitism, and also the rise of capitalism and industrial society upsets society. I mean, we're upset today because of artificial intelligence and what it's doing to jobs. The Industrial Revolution does the same thing. And Jews, there are prominent capitalists among them. And so that fits in. And then it turns into a biological theory and a misinterpretation of Darwin and a misinterpretation of what Pasteur had to say makes it biological. And that's what Hitler believed in.
Yeah.
Now, I'll tell you a personal story. I was told this by my mother, that the mailman in our village where we were hidden, I mean, we were hidden in the open. That is, we were there, but we were protected by people. The mailman approached my mother and said the men had left. They had, my father and my uncles, they'd gone off and had joined the Gauze army. But there was my grandmother and my mother and me. And the mailman said, who was a sympathizer of Vichy and quite right-wing, said, I know why we're supposed to turn in Jewish men, because the Jews are enemies of the Germans. But what do the Germans want with women and babies? And he didn't understand the racial element. He was a sort of old-fashioned anti-Semite. He hadn't bought into Jews are like a bacteria. But for Hitler, Jews were a bacteria. They were like the way we treat the smallpox or the polio viruses and infectious diseases. It's legitimate to try to wipe them out.
Yeah.
If you don't believe that, it sounds ridiculous.
Yeah.
If you believe it.
There was that kerfuffle last month when Bret Stephens wrote that op-ed in the New York Times about that older paper showing that Ashkenazi Jews are like 15 points higher on the IQ score on average, and they have a disproportionate number of Nobel Prizes in science and literature, and they dominate certain fields and so on. And he was basically saying it's not biological like this older paper said that, but it's cultural. And he got hammered even for bringing the subject up, because there's still that sense like there's something biological, but even if you say it's not biological, you're still talking about it like as that topic. I don't know if you saw that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of course, I saw it. This is not a subject that I'm really qualified to talk much about. I've read things. I think that the prevailing view among people who really know is that much of our behavior has some hereditary component and some environmental component, and what genes are actually activated and how they're activated varies, and it varies. It's so complicated that you certainly can't say that heredity determines everything, but it determines some things.
Yeah.
Now, what I've read about race is that categorizing, and this is what happens among prejudiced people, categorizing races in these broad general terms. There's a black race, there's a yellow race. That's complete nonsense.
Yeah.
More genetic diversity within Africa than in any other continent, and there are huge differences. And so there are micro differences, and saying that all Jews are bright or all Jews are this or that doesn't really make any sense. When IQ tests were developed, IQ tests have always been problematic. When they were developed around 1920, maybe a little earlier, I think maybe during World War I.
Yeah, the early army tests.
Yeah. They found that Jews and Italians were inferior. Well, because they were measuring people who had come as immigrants and didn't know English well.
Right.
So,
yeah.
I've always done well on IQ tests, and that was great for being an academic. It didn't make me a particular.
Well, I only brought it up just to make the point that it's still a sensitive subject. I want to be mindful of your time because we're an hour and 20 minutes into it here, but I didn't want to let go this whole discussion of the difference between Trotskyism and Stalinism, or Trotskyism and Leninism, because I binge watched that Netflix series about Trotsky. And it's really quite well. But he looked to me just as violent as Stalin, but he didn't have the power to do what Stalin did. And then Stalin has him murdered or whatever. Can you just tell us a little about what's the difference between Stalinism, Trotskyism, Leninism, and Marxism?
Okay, well, Marxism was the theory.
Yeah.
Okay. And Marx would have liked to have political power, but he never got any. And he was an irascible man, and he probably would have been a terrible politician. Lenin was the organizer in Russia and created a strong party. And he understood that you needed a small elite to run things as professional revolutionaries. And that's what he created. So there were only a few thousand of them, but they were ready to take over. Trotsky was just as brutal as Lenin. When sailors revolted in Kronstadt, the big naval base right outside of St. Petersburg, Trotsky crushed them and was willing to kill as many people as necessary. The competition between him and Stalin, was personal. They hated each other. Trotsky had contempt for Stalin. Trotsky spoke many languages. He used to come to Politburo meetings with French novels and read them in French to embarrass his colleagues, who he thought were less well educated. But Trotsky had no sense that he was hated by many other top leaders because he was so arrogant. And Stalin was just the opposite. He was, until he had complete power, more modest, a compromiser. He could explain things to new members of the party who were not great intellectuals. And Trotsky was an arrogant son of a bitch, really, but brilliant. As long as Lenin was alive and in power, he used Trotsky, and Trotsky organized the Red Army. He did a great job. Their policies were very similar. Probably Trotsky would have killed fewer people, only as many as necessary. Stalin became paranoid and killed far more people than was necessary, including old friends, even family members, old followers of Lenin who were not particularly threatening to him. He had a sense of revenge and meanness, which I don't think Trotsky had nearly as much. And that's something to watch out in leaders, meanness. So you can be a committed revolutionary. And I have something in the book about Ho Chi Minh, and I think he was like that. He wasn't an inherently mean person. He was willing to kill people. They killed a lot of people. And when they came into power in North Vietnam, they liquidated tens of thousands of peasants and so on. He wasn't an inherently mean man who wanted revenge for things. Stalin was. Mao was as well. And so that made them kill far more than was necessary. Would Trotsky have killed people? He would have killed millions of people, but probably not as many. And he certainly wouldn't have turned on the party the way he did, or exterminated most Soviet generals the way Stalin did. Stalin became paranoid and mean.
Yeah.
And
but was Trotsky more of an internationalist, and Stalin, because of Hitler, became more of a nationalist?
Well, yes. Well, I mean, Trotsky was long out of power when Hitler came to power. And he was killed in Mexico, with an ice pick.
Yeah.
Stalin was, in some sense, a nationalist even earlier on. When Lenin asked him to write about the ethnic problem in Russia before the revolution, because he asked Stalin, because Stalin was a Georgian and therefore from an ethnic minority, Stalin wrote that in each region of Russia, there should be a dominant language. And ultimately, he did believe that Russian was the dominant language. But so there should be, Georgian should be used in Georgia, but Russian too, and elsewhere. And the limit, I mean, there are hundreds of languages just in the Caucasus. He didn't believe that any of those should have their own system. He turned to nationalism explicitly during World War II, in the very early stages. And there's a famous speech he made, which you can see on YouTube, and I believe it has subtitles, in which he lists Russian heroes from the Middle Ages and through Napoleonic times, and appeals to Russian nationalism. And so he played that up. Did he actually believe that? Well, he believed that Russians should be dominant, but more as a practical matter. Was he a Russian nationalist? Well, I suppose in a way, and he recreated the Russian Empire. By the way, when he gave that speech, it was the first time most people in the Soviet Union had heard him. And I read that they were quite shocked to hear his Georgian accent, which was quite
interesting.
I mean, it wasn't a secret that he was a Georgian, but so his Russian was obviously very good, but he did have a Georgian accent.
Yeah.
So Trotsky was very definitely an internationalist, and Stalin had said that socialism should be built in Russia first and then spread out. And Trotsky wanted to be more international at first.
Right.
What happened if Trotsky had been in power in 1940? We don't know. He almost certainly would have turned to Russian nationalism as mobilizing people.
Yeah. When I was in Moscow last year, I also went to that the World War II museum, but they don't call it that. They call it like the War of Liberation, or the, I forget what it's called now.
The Great Patriotic War.
Yeah, the Great Patriotic War. And it's like, wow, this is a rather different perspective than the American Western perspective, and I can see why. I mean, was it they lost 27 million soldiers and civilians in the war? The cost they incurred was way more than all of the Allies combined.
Yes, that's true, and also their contribution was greater. So at the time of the Normandy invasion, there were something like 50 German divisions in France fighting against the Normandy invasion, and about 150 fighting the Soviet army.
Yeah.
And then another, I don't know, 10 to 20 in Italy. But if all those German divisions on the Eastern Front had been available in France, the Normandy invasion would have failed.
Yeah.
So yes, and they sacrificed. Some of their sacrifices were because of Stalin's mistakes. That's a whole other story. He made terrible mistakes, especially in the beginning. And also the Soviet army, the American army was known for trying to preserve men and sacrificing material. And the Soviet army was kind of the opposite. They were willing to throw in men, and they had special, basically suicide detachments, often with people they didn't care for, criminals and so on. And they kept behind the lines the most trusted troops who would shoot anyone who was trying to flee back. So so soldiers knew, you either got killed by the Germans, but if you tried to run away, you'd get killed by your own men.
Yeah.
So the Americans didn't do that. It was a different conception of warfare. The Soviets conducted very brutal warfare and suffered huge casualties. And the Americans and the British weren't as, of course we suffered casualties, but not as much. But it's like what I said earlier about warfare. It becomes a different subject than my book.
Yeah. Well, I loved your book, and I particularly like the way you do history, not just A, B, C, D, E, F, G happened, but A happened, then B happened, then C happened. Now let's stop and think about, why did it happen in that sequence and not some other sequence? Let's go to some other part of the world. Let's use this other example, test this hypothesis. So you're thinking like a scientist, which I of course like. So let's just kind of wrap this up with your final chapter. Are there lessons for us to learn? You offer, I think, eight lessons. We don't have to go through them all, but just kind of give us a quick overview from the lessons chapter. What can we learn from this history?
So when problems pile up in a society, moderate reform, gradual reform is necessary. And if it's not done, the problems pile up, frustrations mount, and then some sort of crisis, a depression, a war, something, a series of incidents happen. And that opens the way for those who say, oh, it's not working, we have to change everything. And that is dangerous. I'm not in favor, in most cases, of revolution. But I recognize that if you don't reform in time, if you don't adapt to social change in time, then you provoke a revolution. You can compare France to Britain. People have been doing this for a long time. England in 1900 was nothing like England in 1800. It had become industrial, urban, and though there were revolutionary movements, they were pretty easily put down because the English elite sort of gave in 1832, and then with the First Reform Act, and then the Second Reform Act in the 1860s, that gave the vote to the majority eventually of men. They didn't give the vote to women until later, but and France had a much harder time adapting to the Industrial Revolution. And after the French Revolution, there were other revolutions. There was one in 1830, there was one in 1848, there was one in 1870, 71, and continued resistance. And so it's possible to adapt to change. The United States has done, except for the issue of race and slavery, pretty well in meeting the challenges of industrialization. When that doesn't happen, then you have a potential for revolution. And then if the moderates lose power, we're screwed.
Right.
If the extremists take power, then we're in really big trouble.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to say. And the extremists can be on the right, they can be on the left.
Yeah.
But I'm a convinced middle of the road.
Yeah.
Liberal in the larger sense.
Classical liberal.
Yeah, I have at times voted for Republicans and at other times for Democrats. My colleagues consider me quite conservative, but you remember what I said about Burke.
Yeah.
Yes, he's a conservative, but he wasn't a reactionary.
Right.
He didn't believe that the monarchy was divine and you should have the kind of monarchy that Louis XIV had. He liked the British system, with the parliament and so on. So I believe that, and you can't throw everything out and start anew because that leads to disaster.
Yeah. Here's what I wrote on the top of your chapter there. Popper's Paradox of Tolerance. Karl Popper in his book on the Open Society, if we're tolerant of the extremists and the intolerant people, then they can come to power. It opens the door for them. Yet we want to be tolerant.
Well, in a well-balanced system, that's all right. There were fascists who were Nazi sympathizers in England. They were jailed some of them, the leaders, at the start of World War II. But until then, they were allowed to talk, and that's all right. And if it wasn't for the war, they would have been allowed to keep on talking. So it's certainly acceptable to tolerate the kind of speech you don't like. The danger is not in being tolerant. The danger is when moderate reform, and moderate liberals, whether more classical ones who are now called conservatives, are in power, or people slightly to the left are in power. If moderate reformers fail, then the extremists become more dangerous, and that's really the message.
Yeah.
It's not that we should repress anyone who says what we don't like.
Right.
You remember when Nazis paraded, or neo-Nazis, in a suburb of Chicago? There was this big issue that was mostly a Jewish suburb. Should we allow this?
Oh, Skokie, Illinois, where the ACLU defended him.
Right, exactly. And the ACLU was right. What's dangerous is if we have a situation where there's so much frustration that those kind of movements actually come close to getting power.
Right.
Then we're in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this idea that, Mein Kampf should be banned and people shouldn't read it. No, people should read it because it's a lesson for us to read the extremist literature so we know what they're thinking.
It's actually so boring.
I know it's a bad read. I know. It's terrible.
Hard to read through it. But you can read some passages, and it's certainly worth reading some passages.
Yeah.
Because you see his whole future plan explained.
Right.
Toward Jews, toward Russia. Those are the two big things. Germany needs to expand, and it needs to conquer Russia.
Right. Yeah.
And we have to get rid of Jews.
Well, Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the show, and especially for writing the book. You say you want a revolution. You hung a question mark on there. I like that. Radical Idealism and Its Tragic Consequences. Congratulations. It's a great read. Thanks for doing it.
Thank you for having me.